And this manager, like, he's fuming. And he just says, follow me into the elevator, up to the 14th floor. And you can smell hashish smoke in the corridor. And hear this noise, like what sounds to me like a rooster crowing and breaking glass. He stomps down the corridor with me in tow, doesn't even knock on the doors, opens it with his pass key. All I can see is a wall of hashish smoke. And I hear this rooster. And then the smoke lifts, and there's this stark naked girl, apart from a pair of panties, sitting on the edge of the bed, completely off her face on dope. Michael J. Pollard, wearing a pair of ladies' panties, chasing a stoned rooster around the suite. Literally, he's tripping over, knocking over vases. And the manager says, do something. So I grab the rooster. I don't know if you've ever held a stoned rooster.
No.
Yeah. Horrible sharp claws, and it's trying to peck me and missing. And Pollard's going, give me my baby back, give me my baby back.
Hello everyone, my name is David Hill and welcome to my brand new celebrity podcast, Schmoozing, where I put the careers and lives under the microscope of some of my favourite people and friends. Today's episode is brought to you by the brilliant team at 12A Studios. And here with me, sitting opposite, controlling all things technical, is Jack Pallister. Morning, Jack.
Good morning, David. How are you?
Yes, I'm good, thank you.
So this week, David, I've decided to get back into one of my favourite pastimes, which is reading. I haven't read for a while because things have been quite busy and I just haven't had the time. And I usually do it when I'm on holiday or when I'm sitting in the sunshine. So I've got back into reading, and I do quite a lot of the research for the guests that we have on this podcast, and I wanted to start reading one of our guests' novels. So I've started the first Roy Grace novel, and I am absolutely hooked. I mean, I love crime fiction, I love thrillers, and it's a page turner. I can't put it down. I love it.
No, it was that book that you're reading, Jack, was my introduction to this next guest, and I'm completely hooked on the whole series now. And of course, as we will be discussing later, there's even the TV show, which is very exciting.
Now, when I read, this won't surprise you, David, when I read, I do like to enjoy a drink whilst I'm turning the page. And today's gin and tonic is one of my favourites. What is it, David?
I should just, before I answer that, Jack, clarify for our listeners that you do like a drink with anything that you do. It doesn't have to just be reading, does it?
Yeah, no, unfortunately, I do associate it with most of my day-to-day activities.
Well, today's drink is not so much a drink, Jack, it's a production. So I've actually mixed one of my favourite drinks, which is a Silent Pool gin, fabulous premium gin from Surrey, a neighbouring county. And I'm mixing it with a Fever Tree aromatic tonic water, and then I'm garnishing it with a slice of cucumber and some juniper berries. What about that, Jack?
Oh my goodness. I'm all over it. My mouth is salivating. Now, if you enjoyed today's episode, please remember to rate and review us, and of course subscribe so you don't miss out on any upcoming episodes. Now, today's guest is described as the world's master of the crime fiction genre. He's a BAFTA-nominated producer and an international best-selling author. It is none other than Peter James.
So this morning, through the miracle of technology, I am joined by international best-selling author Peter James. Morning, Peter.
Morning, David.
How are you?
Great to be chatting with you. All good. I'm very excited. Lots of kind of big week coming up next week with Roy Grace coming on television and ploughing on with my new book. And it's exciting times.
Yes, well, we are going to dive into that, rest assured. I wish that our listeners could see your background because in the current world that we live in the current pandemic, we're doing lots of these Zoom calls. I'm sure you're doing lots of Zoom calls. I'm doing lots of Zoom calls. I have to say, Peter, that your background is probably the best and the most unique and the most creative I've seen ever so far, because you've got this fantastic collection of police hats, haven't you, behind you?
Yeah, I collect police memorabilia from all over the world. Everywhere that I travel on book promotion, I always tell my foreign publishers that I'd like to meet police, and they're always happy to arrange it. So I've been out with the police in many countries. Moscow, where I've been shot at, India, Sweden, Australia, the States many times. And police love giving badges and other bits of kits as sort of part of their sort of ethos. And so I always take something that I've got duplicates, like a Bobby's helmet or something. And I remember the chief of police of Moscow gave me a Russian Afghan soldier's helmet, which is on display somewhere in my collection. And my real life Roy Grace, who's Dave Gaylor, who's retired Detective Superintendent, basically curates my collection for me.
Well, do you know what, Peter? And it's just something that's occurred to me. I had a very close uncle who was a Bobby, who was in the police. He's long since gone, and I inherited his some of his things, and I'm going to send you something. I'm going to add to your collection, because I've got them there. They're in a cupboard. They're not doing anything, and I just like the idea, actually, that he's got certain things that I could send you something, and it just forms part of your collection, just as a little thank you for doing this podcast.
I would love nothing more than that, David. Thank you.
So we're going to do that, and I think I would be sending them to your new place in. Am I right in saying you moved to Jersey in 2018?
That's correct. Yes, I'm actually doing this podcast. My office is 72 feet up, a granite tower.
Wow!
Where I can actually see St. Malo across the water and most of the island of Jersey.
Sounds amazing. I'm interested to know. I mean, you are such a passionate ambassador for Sussex, and obviously a lot of your books are based in Brighton and Hove. I just wondered what kind of tempted you out of the county, to move to Jersey?
Well, we still have a place in Hove, and always will do, and it's like second home to me. But I love islands, and came to Jersey a long time ago and fell in love with the place. I wasn't at all happy about Brexit, and I wanted more than anything. I found the problem was that being at home in Sussex, I never, in a nice way, but I never got left alone. Yeah. Constantly people saying, "Oh, look, we're opening a shop. Would you mind, popping out and doing it? Or could we pop in and get a book signed?" And my days would just go. I wouldn't get any writing done. It was lovely, having so many people kind of wanting me to do things. But it was kind of rude turning them down. So it's much easier now. So actually, I'm in Jersey. If you want to fly me over, it's not so easy.
I certainly, from my own perspective, I know exactly what you mean about your sort of profile in Sussex, because you won't remember. But I've met you many, many, many times at the various different gala balls that you go to when you're living in Sussex. But the first time we met, Peter, and again, I'm sure you will not remember this, was at a Burns night dinner that we'd both been invited to as guests at the Rendezvous Casino by the lovely Campbell Dixon, who was then the manager there. I don't know whether you remember that.
Cool. I was trying to think where it was. And I think he's sadly died, hasn't he?
He has sadly died. Yeah, lovely man.
He taught me, because I then had the casino featured in a Roy Grace novel. And I asked him, I said, "If you go gambling," I said, "You go gambling?" He said, "Yeah, I like it." I said, "What tricks of the trade can you tell me?" He said, "What you want to do is always go for a casino where there's a bored-looking croupier, a roulette wheel." He said, "Because in most casinos, and particularly ours, even if there's nobody at the table, they have to spin that wheel at least once a minute. And so what they do is, to stave off their boredom, they target a particular number." And he said, "And they normally target 0. And the aims of, and because they've done it so many times, they will get better than average balls landing close to zero. So it's always bet around the numbers close to zero.
I shall remember that now. I shall be applying that next time I'm in a casino, Peter.
Don't blame me if you lose it.
No. Obviously, I in terms of preparing for these podcasts, you will be very happy to know that I load the bases and I do a lot of research, and I've spent the week researching Peter James, although I already knew a lot about you anyway as a someone that lives here in Brighton and Hove, and I found myself, Peter, going down this sort of internet hole about a lady called Cornelia James, who I then discovered had even got her own Wikipedia page. And of course, I'm talking about your mother. She had a fascinating life, didn't she?
She was an extraordinary woman. She was, if you had sat next to my mother on a plane or on a train, I promise you that the moment you got off, the first thing you would do would be run to the nearest bookshop and buy every book I'd ever written, because she would have sold them to you. She was a terrific saleswoman, but she was a fashion student in Austria, and obviously she and her family had to flee in 1938. And she literally arrived at Dover with Juden stamped in her passport, the clothes she stood up in, and a suitcase full of gloving leathers, because she'd been learning glove design. And during the war, she taught occupational therapy to soldiers with their wounded hands by teaching them to make gloves to get their fingers working again. And then at the end, in 1946, she realized there were no nice colored clothes around for women to buy. It was all drab demob stuff. So she dyed arranged gloves in 100 shades of color. And Vogue picked up on this and called her the Color Queen of England. And it kind of shot at her instant fame. She was then asked by Norman Hartnell to make the going away gloves at the Queen's wedding when she was then Princess Elizabeth. So she became hugely successful. And it was quite strange. It was at a time when most women, it was unusual for women to be successful in business. One thing that was astonishing for me at that time was she always hid the fact that she was Jewish. My father was very English. He was a lapsed, disinterested Anglican. And as far as I knew, my mother was Catholic. Her family would come to lunch on Sunday lunch, her brother, and she'd serve them pork and everything. And when I went to Charterhouse, age 13, 10 guys sat on the wall pointing a finger at me going, Jew, Jew, Jew. It may sound weird saying this, but I didn't even really know what a Jew was at that point. So I phoned my mother and I said, are we Jewish? And she said, well, dear, we have a little Jewish blood way back. Boom, and the next day it happened again, and I jumped over the wall, grabbed one of the guys, and beat the crap out of him. But for anybody at Charterhouse back in the 1960s, who either looked Jewish or had a Jewish name or was Jewish, got that same shit. England was incredibly anti-Semitic, and it wasn't until I went to film school, came out of film school in 1970, and it was impossible to get a job. I was film and television school because there was no film industry then. Television, ITV, you had to be born into a union family. BBC, you had to do a 6-year graduate scheme. And my mother's younger brother, a very successful guy out in Canada, said, come out here, it's all happening. So I arrived in Toronto on a Friday night, and they had the whole Jewish Shabbat. And they were astonished. I didn't know what it was. And the next day, one of my uncle's friends sent his daughter to show me around Toronto, and this beautiful Jewish girl turned up in this big red Chevrolet. And then another of my uncle's friends called up and said, I gather you're Nelly's son, you want to get in the film business, can I help you? I suddenly thought, actually, I really like this being Jewish business. Years later, in 1987, when I had my first really successful book out, and I had a 2-page spread in the Daily Mail, they'd asked me, what do you attribute your kind of creative abilities to or whatever? And I said, well, my mum. She arrived here with nothing and built this amazing business up. And phone rings and it's my mum, and I figure she's ringing to tell me wonderful piece. She says, why have you told the whole world we're Jewish? And I was just floored. And I said, Mum, I'm proud of it. I've been in the film and television business, which is 95% Jewish. It's, through looking Jewish or being Jewish, I've had my best breaks in life. And then when she was dying in the Martlets in December 1999, I was holding her hand one day, and she looked at me, she said, "I want to apologize to you for being Jewish." And I said, "Mum, why have you hidden it all your life?" And she said, "I was just scared when we arrived here as refugees that maybe the Nazis might rise up again and you kids would be better off not knowing. And also, it was a real disadvantage to be a woman in business in the 1950s, let alone to be a Jewish woman. And that's why I kind of buried it.
For her and her generation, it was terrifying, wasn't it? I mean, she had to literally leave home, and I think, Peter, she was on her way to the States, really, was where she wanted to be until she met your father.
Yes, she'd met a guy in Austria that she was going to marry, and they got kind of separated when the family had to flee. And then she was literally going to be shipped out to America, because they were sending all the Jewish refugees from Germany and from Austria either to Canada, America, or Australia. And the only way they could stay was to marry. And they met. She and my dad met, in fact, at a tennis club, and 4 weeks before she was due to leave. So they married. But they married 4 weeks after they met.
That's an incredible story, and I almost, when I was doing the research, I almost got lost in her story, and I had to kind of remind myself this is about Peter, and I just wondered, have you ever thought about writing a book about her, because it's such a compelling story, particularly her rise, from coming here with nothing other than a suitcase, as you say, filled with some leather, to then becoming the official glove maker of the Queen and the royal family. It's just astounding.
Yeah, I do want to. I'm planning to write a novel about bringing in my family's experiences, because her youngest sister, I mean, they had a horrendous time in Austria. People don't kind of realize Kristallnacht, when all the kind of Nazi youth were rampaging, smashing glass. And she was at school, and she was her brother, one of her elder brother, Herman, was literally dragged out of the school and told, you clean that grass up, and they were kicking him. And just she marched out there, sent him back in the school and said, I'm going to clean it up. Kick me if you want. And people don't realize just the absolute horror of it all. And we have a family mystery that I'm planning to write about, a standalone next year, which is her younger sister. They all got into Switzerland, then went off from Switzerland on into England, and then some stayed in England. My mother and her eldest brother stayed in England. Youngest brother and 3 siblings went to Canada and the States. And her younger sister suffered a little bit from depression. And her younger brother, Joe, an incredible guy, he was internet dating for his third wife at 95. he became hugely successful, one of the computer pioneers. He became chief scientific advisor to the government. And Laura and I would go over and see him every year. And I remember he died 2 years ago at 97. And 2 years before he died, he was threatening to run off with Laura. And he said, when my second wife died and I was 85 and I went on the internet, I had loads of replies. He said, now at 95, I'm really not getting very many. But he made a kind of fortune in his early years, and he bought all his siblings out in Canada a house. And not long after buying, his youngest sibling, Erica, my aunt, did suffer from depression, and she married this guy who was quite a ne'er-do-well, always in financial trouble. And Joe bought them a house. Not long after, they went on holiday to the Niagara Falls, and according to Louis, the husband, she had a headache in the middle of the night. I went off to try and get some aspirin, and she was found 2 days later at the bottom of the Niagara Falls. And this was in 1964. And just before he died, my uncle Joe said to me, I've always been suspicious about that guy. So I'm now going to write a novel bringing in the whole exodus of my family from Austria and this settling around this mystery. So I'll come back in 2 years' time and talk to you about it when it's done.
Yeah, I know. I can't wait to read that. Did your mother, in the course of her, building up this business, did she meet the Queen? Did she meet the royal family?
Yes, quite a number of times. She dealt primarily with the Queen's dresser, who was quite a formidable lady, in a good way. And the Queen was actually quite not thrifty, but would keep clothes a long time. So my mom, I can remember one of my strongest memories of my mum, childhood memories of my mum, is on a Sunday evening, sitting watching, I think it was Bruce Forsyth, the Sunday night of the London Palladium. And my mum sitting in an armchair, personally herself repairing one of the Queen's gloves, just literally stitching. She was an incredible royalist and so proud about it.
I think the wonderful kind of, I suppose, the legacy of your mother continues, doesn't it? Because your sister's taken over the business. It's still going strong. I found myself on the Cornelia James website yesterday, Peter, looking for my own mother. I thought, this is, I've got to get some of these incredible gloves, and they look fantastic. So it's wonderful, isn't it, that the story continues through your sister.
My sister's doing a great job, and it's been brilliant recently, of course, with the one good thing for the business with the pandemic is people wearing gloves, and they produce a glove that I think is infection proof.
Yeah, no, I saw that. So you mentioned earlier that obviously you went to Charterhouse, you went from there to Ravensbourne Film School, and then you got this opportunity to go to Canada, and you were working in, and I think. I certainly didn't know that part of your career, that you'd actually spent a long time working in film, both as a screenwriter and as a producer. What was that like, Peter? I mean, what was that period of your life like?
It was interesting. I mean, it was, in one sense, it was kind of great. It all came about as things do in life, slightly by accident. I'd gone out as a kind of naive 22-year-old to Canada, and I got this job. Working on a daily program for preschool children called Polka Dot Door. It was basically a puppet show. And one day the producer came, I'd been there about 3 months, and I was a gopher, which was the lowest human life form on a television set. You can go for this, go for that. And the producer came in a panic. He said, "The writer's sick. He didn't bring in a show today. I read your CV. You won your school poetry prize. Can you write today's show?" And they stuck me in a corner with an IBM golf ball selectric, and I wrote the show, and they were happy with it. And they took me on for a year, writing it 3 days a week. And then I met an American film director called Bob Clark, who'd been a draft dodger. A lot of the draft dodgers came up to Canada and stayed. And Bobby was trying to put together a low-budget horror film called Children Shouldn't Play with Dead Things. And I'd always been a bit of a kind of horror film buff. And I spoke to my uncle, and I said, do you know anybody that might put up money for a film? They were trying to raise $60,000. He said, well, actually, the Canadian government's just announced this incredible tax break for high-risk investments, where people can basically put their money into a movie, and if the film's a bust, they can write off everything. And it was very easy, so we raised the money, and we made this film, and we made it in Florida, and it became a small success. From there, we started raising more money, making more films, and suddenly we were kind of working. We were with major stars. We had Richard Burton, Liz Taylor, Mickey Rooney, Peter Cook, Isaac Hayes, Stephanie Powers, Michael J. Pollard. But the egos of these stars was a flipping nightmare. I remember with Michael J. Pollard. We made this film in 1973 in Toronto. We're filming in February. And it was Ernest Borgnine and Michael J. Pollard and another wonderful actor called C. Cylinder. And Pollard, I think he was the guy who shot to fame in Bonnie and Clyde. The bug-eyed guy who sat in the back of the car. I think his name was C.W. Moss. But he had an ego kind of commensurate about the size of a planet. And mostly film crews are highly respectful to actors, but I've never known a group film crew that so instantly disliked someone. But the second day of filming, it's like really freezing cold February. Pollard fell down a manhole, and nobody stepped forward to help him out. He was completely stoned on grass the whole time. And then I remember getting a phone call from the manager of the Hyatt, where he was staying, 3 o'clock one morning. incandescent, saying there are 3 things in Mr. Pollard's suite right now, and I'm going to throw one of them out the window in 30 minutes' time, and one of those 3 things is Mr. Pollard. I want somebody here now.
Brilliant.
So I use a cigarette lighter to heat your car key to melt the ice on the lock. Drive my iced up car down to and I get to the Toronto Heart, and it's like 3:30 in the morning. And this manager, he's fuming. And he just says, "Follow me," into the elevator, up to the 14th floor. And you can smell hashish smoke in the corridor. And hear this noise, what sounds to me like a rooster crowing and breaking glass. He stomps down the corridor with me in tow, doesn't even knock on the doors, opens it with his pass key. And all I can see is a wall of hashish smoke. And I hear this rooster. And then the smoke lifts, and there's this stark naked girl, apart from a pair of panties, sitting on the edge of the bed, completely off her face on dope. Michael J. Pollard, wearing a pair of ladies' panties, chasing a stoned rooster around the suite. Literally, he's tripping over, knocking over vases. And the manager says, "Do something." So I grab the rooster. I don't know if you've ever held a stoned rooster.
No.
Yeah. Horrible sharp claws, and it's trying to peck me and missing. And Pollard's going, "Give me my baby back, give me my baby back." And we kind of backed out the room, shut the door, and go back down the corridor and get in the elevator. And this stony-faced manager, and I said, "Here's the bird." He says, "I don't want that goddamn thing." So I'm now thinking, what the hell am I going to do with a rooster in the middle of Toronto, 3:45 in the morning? And the doors open, and to my eternal good fortune, there were 4 completely drunk businessmen in tuxedos walking across the foyer. And one of them said, "Gee, is that a rooster?" And I said, "Yes, would you like it?" He said, "Oh, thanks." I was done.
You were done.
Writing novels, I don't have to deal with that crap.
No, I guess not. Now, we briefly interrupt today's interview with some very special news from our fabulous sponsors at Sussex and Surrey Gin Fest.
Hello, it's Alison Ferns here from BBC Radio Sussex and BBC Radio Surrey. Join me as I host the UK's largest outdoor gin festivals in Sussex on the 10th of July and Surrey on the 11th of September. We've got a whole host of artisan gin distillers on site for you to discover, as well as gourmet food and first-class entertainment. Tickets are going fast, so make sure to book now at sussexginfest.com or surreyginfest.com. We look forward to sipping a gin and tonic or 2 with you this summer.
You say, you obviously worked with a lot of very, very famous people. I just wondered whether any of them, you continued any of those relationships. Did any of them become friends? Do you still see any of them, Peter?
Yes, I became very good friends with Terry Thomas. I made a comedy with him, which I wrote and produced, called Spanish Fly, which we shot in 1975. Unfortunately, it came out the same week as Jaws in 1976, and Jaws did slightly better. But it was Barry Norman called Spanish Fly the worst British film since the Second World War and the least funny British funny film ever made. I saw Barry years later at the Harrogate Crime Writing Festival, and I said, "You bastard, you trashed my film." He said, "It was a bit shit, wasn't it?" But Terry Thomas and I became mates, and we kept in touch for a long time until sadly he was kind of too stricken with Parkinson's. I worked with Sharon Stone, kept sort of friendship with her for many years, still in touch with her. And she was great fun. Al Pacino, I've got a standing invite to play poker with him in New York. There was some amongst, there were a lot of them big egos, but some truly delightful. Al Pacino was one of the most delightful people I've ever worked with. Just a nice man and totally not greedy. We did Merchant of Venice with him, it was Al Pacino and Joe Fiennes and Jeremy Irons, and 3 guys. Well, I remember when we had the New York premiere, I was with my now ex-partner, Helen, and we went out, we had dinner with them at the Soho House in New York. And we just sat around the table telling dirty jokes for 3 hours, and occasionally going outside for fags. And she said, "I can't believe we've been sitting with these 3 superstars, and it's just been like sitting with a bunch of mates." And the person I've got a little bit to know now, I'm really looking forward to having a drink with, because I think he's just a great guy, is John Sim, who's starring in Grace. Just a lovely guy. and he's now made his home in near Brighton.
Oh, well, we will talk about him. And it's actually, Peter, a good segue actually to sort of dive into really, the core of this podcast for me is clearly to talk about your writing career. So I just, for our listeners, I want to contextualise your level of superstardom really as a writer, because you've written 41 novels, you've sold over 20 million copies worldwide, which has given you 17 consecutive UK Sunday Times number ones, as well as number ones in Germany, France, Russia and Canada. And also you're a New York Times bestseller, and your books have been translated into 37 languages, and you've won over 40 awards. So I put it to you, Peter, that you're doing okay.
I have to say, Dave, I could not be happier with the way my kind of career and life has turned out. But I did have a lot of false starts. Funnily enough, I had a housemaster at Child House who I really disliked, a guy called Ted Hartwell. I thought he was, at the time, the arrogance of youth. I thought, what a complete tosser. And I've still got his leaving report framed. And he wrote, enigmatic and unpredictable as ever, he fits into no known mold. I can't see him flowering in a university setting or in a solicitor's office. To me, a literary career seems inevitable, but there may be some false starts. He was so prophetic.
Wow.
And what's lovely is I'm actually in touch with his widow. She wrote to me about 2 years ago. She's in her 90s now, saying she's a huge fan. And I sent her the report. And I said, what an amazing guy your husband was. But it took me a long time. I wrote my first novel when I was 18. It didn't trouble any publisher. I wrote my second when I was 19, my third when I was 20. They got me an agent in New York, but never got published, luckily, because they were terrible. And then when I did get my first novel published, which was Dead Letter Drop in 1981, it was the most exciting day of my life when I heard the book was going to be published. And the worst day of my life when the book was actually published, because it just wasn't anywhere on sale. I think they printed 1,800 copies, of which 1,500 went to public libraries. And the second book in that series, Atom Bomb Angel, sold even less. And then the third, Billionaire, I think sold even less than that. And I thought, and that was it. I thought my kind of career was over. And they were spy thrillers. And probably the best bit of advice I was personally ever given was I bumped into a friend of mine, then my wife, called Lizzie Buchan, who at that time was working for Penguin, writing jacket blurbs. She's now a very successful author herself. And she said, what on earth are you doing writing spy thrillers? And I said, well, I'd seen an article in the Times that said that Ian Fleming had died and there was a shortage of spy thrillers, so I thought I could write one. She said, what can you ever know about the world of spies? You're up against people like John le Carré, who come out of the security services, Ian Fleming, who was intelligent in intelligence. You'll only succeed writing something, A, you can access to research, and B, that you're passionate about. And it was the best piece of advice. And that was about 1983. We'd recently got married and we bought a house, and we were in the middle of Brighton, and we got burgled. And a young detective came to take fingerprints, a guy called Mike Harris, Brighton Nick. And he saw my books. He said, if you want research help with the police, give me a call. And Mike was married to a police officer, Renata. And my then wife and I became friendly with them. We were at that Greek restaurant, the Parthenon, down by the clock tower.
I know it well.
And then they invited us to a barbecue at their house. This is about 1985, 4 or 5. And there was a dozen of their friends there. They were all cops. There was traffic, response, homicide. And just talking to them, I suddenly thought, wow, nobody sees more of human life in a 30-year career than a police officer. For me as a writer, these are the people I should be kind of writing about. That was the start of it. And when they realized I was genuinely interested, and not just out to grab a story I could flog to the Argus, they started trusting me and started inviting me out in a patrol car, a response car, a traffic car. And they got to the point where they got more comfortable, and they'd say, we've got quite an interesting crime scene, do you want to come on to that? And then they phoned me saying, we're doing a raid tomorrow and a bunch of druggies and so and say block of flats. You up for that? And over the sort of between about mid-1985 and mid-90s, I sort of say I became part of the furniture of Sussex Police is wrong, but they all trusted me. They knew that I wouldn't write anything that they weren't happy about. And I just started putting police scenes more and more into my books. And then in 1997, I was at Hove Police Station, spending a day in the detectives' room there. And they had this most macabre photograph. I've been trying to get it for my collection ever since. It was a Hell's Angel called Ollie, who I think in the mid-1980s had shagged his rival gang leader's girlfriend. And they put him in Shoreham Harbour with the classic cement boots on, literally chained to breeze blocks in his motorcycling leathers. And he'd been at the bottom of the harbour for some while. Then a container ship turned around and his wash brought it to the surface. And it was just the most bizarre thing I've ever seen in my life. It was, all his body gases had expanded. So his body looked like Michelin Man, but his skull had been picked completely clean by crustaceans. So there was this tiny little skull sticking out this huge bloated body. And it would never happen today, but they had it pinned on the wall of the detective room. And it was like macabre cartoon, except it was for real. Anyway, I was at Hove Police Station. Someone said, there's this detective you might quite like to meet called Dave Gaylor. And they took me to his room and I walked in and there were crates on the floor bulging with folders. Dave was sat there with an affable smile. I said, I'm sorry, you're moving. He said, no. He said, I am a homicide detective, but I'm also in charge of cold cases in Sussex. Each one of these crates contains the principal case file of an unsolved murder, where there is somebody still alive who could benefit from the inquiry, whether it's family or whether it's a villain that we could catch. He said, I'm the last chance for the victims to have justice, and I'm the last chance for the families to have closure. And I love that really human image. And then he said to me, what are you writing at the moment? I said, I'm writing a psychological thriller called Denial. He said, I was about halfway through it. He said, tell me about it. So I started telling him. I said, hang on a sec. Why have you got a detective doing that? He wouldn't do that. He'd be doing this. And why hasn't he got an outside inquiry team doing this? Do you think your character would have done that? I don't think. Have you thought about him doing? And I thought, wow, this guy has got a really creative brain. It was something that I learned subsequently, that what makes a really good homicide detective is not the kind of typical stereotype we see on the screen, the sort of the bolshy SIO shouting at everyone, but actually a calm person of high intelligence and high level of emotional intelligence and empathy who bonds with the victim's family. And what the really good ones do, and Dave Gaylor has this, they've got almost a split personality. One side of them is incredibly methodical, anal, because every major crime is a huge puzzle of hundreds, if not thousands of pieces that have to be painstakingly put together. I stayed friends with Dave, and over the next 5 years, he moved up and got promoted until 2002. He was promoted to Detective Superintendent, effectively head of major crime for Sussex. And my publishers, Pam Macmillan, approached me and said, have you ever thought of creating a detective as a central character? So I went to Dave and I said, how would you like to be a fictional cop? And he just loved the idea. And we have worked together on every Roy Grace novel since. We have a kind of tradition of sitting on a particular table at the Ginger Fox just near Henfield with a brand new moleskin notebook and planning each Roy Grace novel, and who I'll need to speak to on research, whether it's in English police or police abroad. And then he reads roughly every 100, 150 pages, as well as my wife, and then we all discuss, and Dave tells me how he thinks that Roy Grace or the police would really think and act. And over the years, we've become very close mates. When Laura and I got married in 2015, Dave was best man. Today we speak almost every day of the week, and we travel to homicide conferences. I always joke, I say some people travel with their private detective. I travel with my private detective chief superintendent.
It was a little bit exciting there when you were talking about that story, because I didn't know. I obviously know already that we have some mutual friends, because that's how we've been connected for this podcast. But I didn't know that you knew Mike Harris and Renata, because they're very good friends of mine. Mike has actually been a very good friend and actually a very big supporter of my events business in my other world. He's been very supportive.
Well, he is more than anybody responsible for, if you like, initiating the path that led to Roy Grace, because we'd become mates, and we had a big party when I was living in Clayton, and we had a huge garden there, and we had a big birthday party for my then wife, and Mike said, the chief constable is looking for the then chief constable is looking for a big venue to host this charity, Common Cause, I think it was, a common purpose that he was very involved at that time. And so I hosted it, and he then said to me afterwards, this was about 1994, 5, he said, how can I repay you? And I said, you could repay me by letting me spend a month spending time in every different division of Sussex Police. And he said, come. And that was really how the start of my kind of even closer relationship with the police began.
And I think, Peter, it's fair to say, isn't it, that you are, on a global scale, you are regarded, your work is regarded with such high esteem because of the level of research and the accuracy that you give to the whole policing process and modern day investigations. In fact, I'm showing you now, I've got my copy of Dead Simple, because obviously I'm a massive Roy Grace fan, and one of the things that you'll find, and I think actually this quote is on several of your books, and it's a quote from the Times where they say, Peter James has penetrated the inner workings of police procedures and the inner thoughts and attitudes of real detectives as no English crime writer before him. And I think that's been a big part of your success in your story, hasn't it?
Thank you. Yes, I was delighted when I was in New Zealand on book tour about 7 years ago, and I was at a radio show. The guy said, "I've now got a guy in the studio with us who's known as the guy who gets it right." And I thought, that's a great compliment. I think that partly there's a number of things here. I think first thing is that everyone who does a job wants to see it portrayed accurately on film or on television. And none more than the police. I mean, I know so many coppers who shout at the screen at crime shows. Funnily enough, John Sims' father-in-law was 30 years a Met cop. And he said, my father was always shouting at the screen at cop shows. He said, but secondly, I think more importantly, even than that, is that people who read, but the mere fact that they're reading, are intelligent. And I think that when we read something, a novel, to read fiction, we don't just want a story. Obviously, that's an important part of it, but at the same time, we want to experience life. We want to learn something about the human condition, about the world in which we live, through the pages of that novel. And that's why I write primarily in the police genre, because, as I said, nobody sees more of human life in a 30-year career than a police officer. So to me, it's really important to get the details of their work right. And I think the reason that the police themselves, not just across the UK, but in many other countries like my books, is that I show people what being a police officer really is. I think so often people think, it's great, you join the police so you can go into somebody's house and push them around. The vast majority of police officers join the police because they want to make a difference to the world. It's not a high-paid job. It's one of the few jobs where every time a police officer leaves his or her home in the morning, their partner doesn't know if they're going to come back hurt or come back at all. And they see the most horrific things that most of us, fortunately, will never have to see. One instance is a traffic officer I know who about 10 years ago, maybe a little bit more, there was a horrific double murder over in East Sussex. It was a divorce, husband and wife, and the wife, to get back at the husband and actually try to frame the husband, gassed to death their two small children. I think they were like 2 and 4, and left them in the boot of a car. And my traffic officer friend was first on the scene, and he tried to resuscitate them, but they already blew by the time he got there. And then he has to go from dealing with that home and bath his own 2 and 4-year-old kid. And the emotional stress on the police all the time. The head of the Met said a few years ago, he said, when we are ordinary people doing extraordinary things. That when everyone else is running away from danger, we and the other emergency services are the guys running towards it. And people forget that about, and the other great quote is that wearing a uniform doesn't protect you from emotion.
I want to ask you a question that I've faced. I've already mentioned, you already know that I'm a massive fan. I'm a big fan of Roy Grace and a big fan of crime fiction. But even with my own partner, he kind of teases me about the fact that I read crime fiction and that I'm slightly obsessed with reading crime fiction. So I get this from other people, and I think there's a sort of snobbery around it, and for me it's completely and utterly unjustified, and I just wanted to see what you thought about it.
It's music to my ears that you're saying this, David, because a few years ago, Ian Rankin and I did an event together at the Glasgow or the Edinburgh Festival, talking about just this, about why is crime fiction ghettoized. And when I was chair of the Crime Writers Association for 2 years, and I made it my platform to try to fight that snobbery, that perceived snobbery. Because if you go back into literature, go back to Sophocles, Oedipus, if he'd written that as a novel, that would be on the crime shelves today. If you look at Shakespeare, I think Shakespeare wrote plays because at that time there weren't hardly any books. I mean, and hardly anybody could read. So if you wanted as a writer to communicate, you became a playwright. Well, over half of Shakespeare's plays have courtroom scenes. And if you look at his tragedies, Othello, Macbeth, Hamlet, if he was writing today, I think he'd be writing novels. And where would his novels be? I think they'd be on the crime shelves. And people say, why do people like reading crime fiction? Well, I could go on for that for quite a long time, but in a real nutshell, first and foremost, I think that if you want to go at a really deep level, we are all genetically programmed to try to survive. And part of the pleasure and part of the interest in reading crime fiction is to read about gruesome murders and think, how did the victim get in that situation? How can I make sure I never get in that situation? What can we learn from that? That's at a very deep subconscious level. At a more superficial level, I think we are deeply fascinated by murder. Now, what is the difference between the person who kills and me? What is it that enables a Peter Sutcliffe or a Fred West or a Nielsen to do it and get away with it? You and I are both capable of committing murder. We've got bare hands, we'd strangle somebody. I bet you've got some knives in your kitchen. I bet you've probably got some tools in your garden. You've certainly got a bin liner so you could chop up and get rid of a body. We've all got the means to commit murder, but most of us fortunately never do. And I think we are fascinated because it's the ultimate crime. I mean, Martin Richards, the former Chief Constable of Sussex, once said to me, murder is the only crime for which there is no restitution. You steal somebody's money, you can give it back to them or give some of it back. You take someone's life, you have destroyed not only that person, but you've destroyed all their loved ones forever.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. You've referenced, obviously, the fantastic TV series Grace that now puts Roy Grace onto the screen. I just wondered what your opinion was of John Sim as Detective Superintendent Roy Grace. I mean, do you think has he done the character justice as far as you're concerned, Peter?
When I first created Roy Grace in my head, John Sim was almost exactly how I imagined him looking. And because I always say about Grace is that if I ever was unlucky enough to have a member of my family murdered, Roy Grace is the detective I'd want running the investigation. John has got all the elements that I kind of previously mentioned in terms of empathy, emotional intelligence, warmth, perseverance in spades. He is my absolute dream, Roy Grace. But I love that John thinks about things. There's a scene in Dead Simple when Glenn is, Roy Grace, for those who obviously don't know him, when we first meet him, we learn that his wife, Sandy, who he loved and adored, had vanished off the face of the earth several years earlier on his birthday. And for years he's been looking for her. He doesn't know, did she run off with a lover? Was she murdered, abducted, have an accident? What happened? So while he functions as an effective homicide detective, his life is dogged by the ongoing mystery. He even tries mediums, anything. In all those years, he hasn't moved on, hasn't dated again. So Glenn sets him up with a blind date, and Roy goes off at the start of Dead Simple to meet this woman. It's a blind date from hell, but he's going off to meet her in a pub. And John Sim emailed me the day before they shot the scene, and he said, do you think when I go in the pub I should be wearing my wedding ring or should I take it off? And I love that he thought that much detail about it.
Peter, I've got two final questions for you, and they are personal, actually, in many ways. And the first one is, I've just bought a rather expensive, fancy schmancy, height-adjustable desk that I have perfectly positioned looking out over Palmyra Square where I live, which of course you will know very, very, very well. So I've positioned the desk looking out over the window. I've got two, not one, I've got two cracking stories. And I've got the links and the people and the organisations, I think, to do the research properly. So my question to you is, what do I do next?
I think planning is important. The first step in planning is to know the end. I always liken it. You wouldn't get in the car and start driving unless you had some idea where you're going, whether it's to Tesco down the road or to Cornwall or wherever. So it's know the end. And I plan the high points of a book. Like, what are the three key high points? Like the gosh wow moments. The first gosh wow moment in Dead Simple is when they put them in the coffin, buried them in the woods, and then they all get wiped out in the car crash. It's that. So I put that kind of the three key high points. You may end up with a lot more high points, but it's getting a structure. And then I plan the first 20% of the book, which is roughly 100 pages, in detail. But what I would suggest you do is take the kind of book that you would like to write, like a blockbuster, big selling book. Look at 2 or 3 of them and deconstruct them. If you were going to be a doctor, you go to medical school, you'd be given a cadaver for a year, and you dissect it, either virtually or for real. So we all learn from our peers. That's what I've always done. When I've read a book and I thought, wow, I wish I'd written that. I literally pick it apart in my head.
I know you are a petrol head, Peter, and I always say to people, this will make you laugh, my one heterosexual quality is that I love cars, Peter. And I've always loved cars. So my question to you is a hypothetical question. I've just been given, Peter, hypothetically, £200,000. Someone has just bequeathed me £200,000. But what they've said to me is, you can only spend that £200,000 on a car. Which car do I buy?
Well, you've got a limited but fantastic choice, because for about 150, 160, quality of engineering of today's Porsches is just fantastic. I currently drive a 911 Targa. It's a fantastic car, but the two best cars I've owned are Bentley Continental Speed. It was fire engine red as well. I had that car for about 10 years, absolutely loved it. And the other one, which has got more soul than any car. If you want a car that people will smile at you in, rather than going, rich fucker, shouldn't have that. It's an Aston Martin.
So, Peter, we are going to take you through the green door, which is the feature of the show where we ask each of our guests to contribute to a story that I've started with this podcast. It is particularly thrilling to get your input into this, because this is the first time we've had, a global, international best-selling author contributing to our meagre story. And
no pressure.
No pressure, Peter. Yeah. Before I ask you to read your section, I was just really interested. Obviously, so far, I've started the story off. Then we had Olympic gold medalist Sally Gunnell contributed the next paragraph. Then from the hit series It's a Sin, Jill Nolder, and then the adventurer Neil Lawton. We've had Debbie McGee contribute, and of course Robin Cousins, another Sussex neighbour of ours. And I just wondered which one of the paragraphs so far jumped out at you as being particularly well written. I have an opinion, and mine isn't. I don't think it's mine, but I just wondered what your thoughts were.
Honestly, David, I was blown away by the quality. I thought, I thought you set the scene brilliantly. Sally Gunnell, as you'd expect from a fantastic runner, ran with it.
Yes,
and did a great job. And Jill Nolder left, I think, a really good cliffhanger, probably the best cliffhanger. With her line, a look of horror crossed his face. And Neil Lawton, again, I loved his cliffhanger. I wouldn't open that door if I was you. like Debbie kept it going neatly, and of course Robin Cousins turned the whole flipping thing on its head.
Yes. Yes. He's left you with a.
Robin,
Yeah.
but that's real creativity. I think I won't say skating on thin ice here.
I love that. Well, just to explain to our listeners who might be tuning in for the first time and have not caught up with the story so far, and it is on the website, so everybody can find this on our website, which is schmoozingpodcast.com. So here we go. This is the way that Robin took it down a very different direction. Ozzy, Sharon, what the... Henry caught himself. Language like that does not belong in this story, but his mind was racing with so many questions. He turned back just in time to see his mother morphing into some kind of creature, enveloped in a deep purple mist. Her hair becoming snakes and her tongue forked as she hissed and floated towards him, elevated from the floor. Henry quickly slammed the door, returning his gaze into the room as Ozzy's cackling laugh echoed around the room. Then, silence, as Henry heard the key drop from outside the door behind him. As he stood frozen, what had once been his mother seeped through the keyhole, and a damp, pungent mist began to envelop the room.
Henry woke up with a start, feeling that slow spread of relief you get in the middle of the night when you surface from a nightmare and realize you are okay, you are fine. He lay, his heart feeling like he had a freaked out cage bird thrashing around inside his chest. Jesus, what a weird dream. Green. His mother, who was deeply superstitious, never wore green. Green was an unlucky color for a lot of people, she said. And as for buying a green car, well, she wouldn't even go in one. But dreams tell you things, unresolved issues in your life. Was that his imagination going rampant? Or was his dead father trying to give him a warning from beyond the grave? He reached out for the light switch on the wall above the bed, but to his surprise, it wasn't there. He put his hand out towards the bedside table for his phone, but there was no table. He smelled something pungent, putrid. Panicking, he tried to get out of bed, but then realized he wasn't in bed. He was lying on the floor. And now, to his horror, he realized it hadn't been a dream at all. He actually was in that room, behind the green door.
Just fantastic. Oh, that's amazing. Thank you, Peter. That was just brilliant. That's so fantastic. Interestingly, actually, Robin Cousins sort of hinted that he thought our next guest might take us into a dream sequence, which you did, but then revealed it wasn't a dream at all. Brilliant. I mean, just fantastic. That's great.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad you like it.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Thank you so much. And we will get that on the website. Brilliant. Thank you, Peter. That was just so good. So good. It's taken it to a different level now. That was the wonderful Peter James. And what a treat to have a real-life, global, best-selling author contribute to our Through the Green Door story. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please don't forget to rate, review, and of course subscribe so you don't miss out on any future episodes. Be sure to join us next week for an Everybody's Talking About Jamie special, which is set to be one of the biggest blockbusters of 2021. I'll be talking to one of the film's stars, Lauren Patel, and her incredible journey from A-level student to rising movie star. Until then, stay safe, stay positive, and stay with me for more schmoozing next week.